Welcome everybody. I'm very pleased to welcome you to today's CSSGJ event. I am Oliver Dodd, one of the 3 co-directors for the Centre. I'm very pleased to be able to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Nazih Richani, who is based at Keene University in the United States. Dr. Richani's research focuses in particular on the Colombian Civil War and its various peacemaking processes. He has published 3 books as well as many articles in his academic career. Dr. Richani is perhaps most known for the application of systems analysis to the question of civil wars and peacemaking experiences. Dr. Richani's most renowned work perhaps is titled Systems of Violence, the Political Economy of War and Peace in Colombia and Beyond, first published in 2002, but which then followed with a second updated edition in 2013, analyzing Colombia's 2016 peace processes and the reasons for the peace agreement. Both books were published by the State University of New York and have also been translated into Spanish and published inside Colombia. Today's talk is partly based on Dr. Richani's 4th upcoming book, which is to be titled The Colombian Peasants in the Neoliberal Age Between War and Terrorism and Sustenance. The title of today's talk is Peasants and Capital in Colombia. Dr. Richani has approximately 40 to 45 minutes for his talk, which should then leave us approximately 40 minutes for the Q&A. Dr. Richani, welcome, and over to you.
Oh, thank you so much. Hello, everybody. The outline of my talk today is the following. I will start with theory and concepts. And secondly, I move into definition of what is a peasant. And thirdly, which is the substantive part of the talk, is war rentierism in Colombia, which covers the period of 1948-2022, if you wish. These are the 3 major components of my conversation with you. So let me start with the theory and concepts. Basically, this talk is, as Oliver mentioned, is based on my current manuscript that is being under review by SUNY Press on the peasantry of Colombia. Family-based farming has been gaining, of course, global attention. The United Nations proclaimed 2014 as the International Year of Family Farming to recognize the family farm's critical role in enhancing food security, and later developed a platform that identified the urgent actions required by government to support especially small farms. So in addition, new research continues to reconfirm the role of small farming and a significant contribution to fighting hunger and starvation. 5 out of 6 farms around the world are small family farms of less than 2 hectares, and they are producing 1/3 of the world's food. Unfortunately, however, neoliberal economics is upending and trying to destroy the family-based peasant economies. The latest plight of peasants in India, for instance, opposing the removal of state subsidies and new laws favoring agribusiness, is a good example. I don't know if you followed, but what happened in India a few months ago. Thousands have taken the streets, bringing the grievances to New Delhi, and the international community demonstrating a fault line that is accentuating by ending the state support model of the 1960s, Green Revolution. that was applied in India, and India remained faithful to the Green Revolution reforms until, of course, the Modi's government was right wing leaning and trying to apply new liberal economic policies. Similarly, as discussed in this manuscript and my talk today, Colombia is undoing of state support to the agricultural sector only accentuated violent conflicts over the years. The basic question that I have regarding the peasantry of Colombia and the peasant economy in Colombia, what is the status of small family-based farming in the Colombian context? How do Colombian small farmers, that is subsistence peasants, and indigenous groups that are based also are peasants, but we can identify them as indigenous and Afro descendants who also depend on agricultural farming or on subsistence farming compared to their counterparts elsewhere in the world. At a glance, we see that Colombian mirrors the global scenario. 32% of its 50 million people live and depend for their livelihood on the rural economy. 32% of its 50 million. But more significantly, it is estimated that the family peasant economy produces more than 51% of the food in Colombia. So they are equally successful to the global standards of the contribution of these small farms and subsistence farms to food production. But their challenges run deeper and are quite formidable in Colombia. This research describes the Colombian peasants' reality, their success in farming while in constant resistance and mobilization to claim their rights and fight the state's economic policies, large land owners' violence, forced displacement, and land grabbing. In my research, I focused really on three different questions. The first question, how did the Colombian peasants survive under adverse socioeconomic and political conditions? Secondly, what are the sources of the resilience, adaptability in the face of the onslaught of neoliberal, what I term war rentierism? And thirdly, what distinguishes the responses and strategies employed by the indigenous groups, Afro-descendants and the peasants' reserves. Peasants' reserves are basically something that the state created in order to preserve the peasant economies. And these peasant reserves have been expanding over the years. But this is, for the time being, if you have any questions regarding this specific component, I will be more than happy to explain. So my research really analyzes the processes and mechanisms of the subsistence peasant economy as practiced by a number of communities that I've took as a sample of my not only a sample, but basically I focused on a number of communities in order to see how what type of policies they have done to allow them to subsist and to maintain their cohesiveness as community and to fight back. So therefore, the role of agency is extremely important in not only in conceptualizing the peasantry, not only as victims, but also as actors and with agency and capability of fighting back. So therefore, it is a process of of resistance on one hand, of and survival, and on the other hand is the onslaught against them. Now, in order to analyze what's happening, and this is maybe apply globally, my research has developed a concept that was initially introduced by Karl Marx, which is the concept of subsumption of capital. And the subsumption of capital of other forms of social organization and production, it is, of course, it was observed by Marx in the 19th century in the context of England. And later, the same concept of subsumption was picked up by Rosa Luxemburg and further developed by Rosa Luxemburg. And I thought that concept of subsumption could explain quite a bit in the 21st century. And so I have theoretically, therefore, used this subsumption. Specifically, I make the distinction that, of course, that was made originally by Marx and then by Rosa Luxemburg, which is the distinction between the formal subsumption and the real subsumption. Now, the formal is when capitalism absorbs all other forms of production and make it capitalist in the strict definition of the word, or take some of the pre-capitalist or non-capitalist formations, take whatever capital needs and keep the remaining. So therefore, in a way, this is a more dialectical type of relationship than it's not binary, it's dialectical. So therefore, I thought this is quite interesting to see how capitalism and its complexity in developing nations in the global South is functioning on a day-to-day basis. That is, incorporates wherever it needs from the non-capitalist present economy, take labor if needed, or take the land if needed, without necessarily dismantling the entire thing. So it is kind of you take as you need. I.e., capital takes as it needs its capital accumulation process. So therefore, it's not that. That's why, for instance, I try to theorize why capital doesn't take it all. Simply, capital doesn't need it all. So therefore, it takes whatever is needed, depends on the changes in the processes of capital accumulation in the global economy, and therefore, and accordingly, it takes whatever is needed from the non-capitalist formations and or coexist with the other non-capitalist formations, and until the moment is ripe to absorb some other components of the non-capitalist formations. Two major things that are essential in this formula. Of course, we have land and labor. Okay, capital in the 21st century doesn't need labor as much. So the essence of the struggle is land in the global South, or at least how identified it, or my finding in terms of my research in Colombia, it boiled down to the issue of land. rather than labor. And the reason why, because simply you have the land is used for different objectives, and with mechanization, and it demands less labor and more land. So therefore, more land for multiple purposes, including mining, or even just for speculation. So therefore, it is this type of economies. I'll come to that later in my presentation. For this specifically, then the way capital is working in a context like Colombia, subsumption occurs when rentier capitalists and agribusinesses resort to grabbing land. Okay, and as I said, hiring some labor when it's needed from peasant communities without totally dismantling their economy. So therefore, the subsistence economy remains there, not intact, affected, but it remains even to support the families that are staying behind or around agribusinesses that are expanding in these areas, or even mines that are expanding in these areas. So therefore, food production becomes part of the chain to sustain that type of capitalist economy in a way. So my analysis is important, since the process of capitalist subsumption does not only threaten a mode of production, giving the massive environmental degradation associated with it, it also threatens the sources of life, food, water, and land. The conceptual framework, as laid out here, more or less, draws on three main theories that address capitalist subsumption and the peasant economy. First and foremost, of course, the Marxist tradition. I draw on that on the Marxist tradition to build my theory. B is the modernization theory that most of you are familiar with. That is basically the thrust of the neoliberal economic thinking. And C is the hybrid theories that drew on the two, meaning on Marxist tradition and modernization. Okay. Now, I will stop here with the issues, the theory and concepts, and move to a second controversial issue, actually, which is how to define peasants. And this is an issue that merits some kind of extra attention, conceptually and methodologically speaking. The irony is, in the Colombian context, for many years, if you review the literature on the Colombian conflict, all of it, or some of it, of course, emphasize how important the unresolved issue of the peasants is the source of the conflict. From the 1920s, if not earlier than the 1920s, and the passing through the period of La Violencia, 1948, 1958, to the insurgency in 1964, to the present. So therefore, three stations or phases in the history of the Colombian conflict, the peasantry occupies in the literature a focal point, meaning it is the source of the conflict. Yet, in the 1991 Constitution, the peasantry were not recognized as a subject. The 1991 Constitution recognized the indigenous communities and the Afro-descendants communities, but did not give any recognition to the subjectivity of the peasantry or the peasant as such, as a social category. So, and the irony of the situation is, it wasn't until 40 years ago, in 2018 to be specific, a tutela, which is the exact translation is like a plea from organizations, social organizations, peasant organizations, and indigenous groups and Afro-descendants groups, presented to the Supreme Court a request whereby to recognize the peasant as a social category. And therefore, when the statistics are conducted, the individual is asked if he's a peasant or she's a peasant or not. So therefore, self-identification as such as a category. Because the census or carried before 2018, we're talking about 4 years ago only. Before that, it did not exist in the census. So you do have either if you're rural or urban, yes, this classification exists, but there was never a question there in the census that asked specifically if you are a peasant or you're not. So they identify the groups, if you are Afro-descendants, if you're indigenous, but nothing about if you're a peasant. See, this figure did not exist before. So therefore, and this has serious consequences, because how would you know how many peasants are in Colombia? Since we don't have a census, telling the researchers, we have speculations. I mean, we have relied on multiple studies and the United Nations, its own surveys and what have you, but we didn't have even an accurate assessment of what type of population we're talking about here. So in order to, and the reason why it's not only conceptual, but also methodological, and thirdly, in order to recommend policies. So in a way, the definition is not only semantics or just for intellectual exercise, but it's for practical purposes, and addition to the conceptual one. Now, according to based on the new census of 2018, we have reached some kind of assessment, more or less, that tells us that 28.4% of the country's population self-identified as peasants. So we're talking about, roughly speaking, a population of 4.2 million. Okay, 4.2 million. Now, since Colombia has been a relatively, not relatively, but it has been really a violent place for a number of years. Of the 7 million internally displaced people in Colombia, which is the total number of displaced, 4.6 million of them were peasants, i.e. 64% of the 7 million were peasants, okay? 64%. So they're carrying, therefore, the brunt of the conflict, the violent conflict. And 58% of the total victims of the conflict are peasants, i.e., they quantified, roughly speaking, that between 1958 and 2018, roughly 432,000 people were killed. And actually between 58 and 2018, 432,493 victims. Of those, 58% were peasants, okay? Using the new definition, conceptual methodological definition of what is a peasant. But equally important, the Colombian state did not recognize this figure. And this non-recognition of the peasantry, I think it's not, it was not accidental, nor it was overlooked. I think the dominant classes in the state have decided to obliterate ideologically and maybe physically also the peasantry of the equation, and that brings me to the issue of war rentierism. War rentierism as a concept, meaning the expansion of rentier economy by the usage of the instrumental usage of violence, i.e., it was a systematic use of violence in order to clear the land of the peasantry. And by doing this, obliterating, it is basically, it is a genocidal, class genocide, really, against the peasantry. It's a class genocide. I mean, but we're talking about the astounding numbers of people killed. I mean, we will see this is really a class genocidal war. Now, it's not hyperbole to say that, and let me share with you some of the figures that I extrapolated on the 1940 and this is the period of La Violencia, 1948-1958, and this is the of course the only research that we have done, serious research on this, was done by Oquist, 1978, and he presented, Oquist presented in his study how many people lost lands during the so-called La Violencia. And let me share with you some of these figures. In Cauca, for instance, the number of displaced in Cauca were 368,000 people. And the land holdings that were transferred from one owner to others, 94,400. Okay, so Cauca was the highest number of displaced people in between the period 1958 during this 10 years interval. In Tolima, 224,000 people, 700 were displaced, and the land holdings that changed hands, 64,900. In Antioquia, which is the third most violent place, was 116,500 number of displaced, and 16,020 were the number of land holdings that changed hands. So La Violencia, it wasn't really an act of violence between two parties that were fighting for political power, but on the ground, what was happening really, a transfer of ownership of lands on the massive scale, really massive scale. Most of these lands ended with in the hands of other owners. So approximately, therefore, 700,000 civilians were displaced from 3 departments, home to 6% of the country's total population in the 1950s. During this same period, the total number of forcefully displaced was 2 million people, or 16% of the country's 12 million population in 1950. So we're talking about 16% of the population. So this is massive in terms of this profound demographic shift predominantly was small and poor peasants and generated all sorts of socioeconomic dislocations and tensions. The new settlements or colonies of displaced people became hotbeds of resistance against the state and large landowners. Massive violent sludging of the rural population has been a continuous process in the country's history since the 1930s, and the rate of privatization of public land rose precipitously during La Violencia from an average of 60,000 hectares per year over the period 1931 to 45 to 150,000 hectares over the period of 46-54 and to 375,000 hectares over the period of 55-59. So La Violencia, therefore, during La Violencia, around or about 1.2 million hectares were abandoned, representing 11.2% of the country's used agricultural land in 1960. 1.9 million hectares, i.e. 11.2% of the country's used agricultural land. La Violencia then became a mechanism, and this is where my conceptualization of war and terrorism comes about. La Violencia then became a mechanism that helped a few accumulate more lands at the expense of the small and medium-sized landowners. More importantly, large landowners continuously appropriated the colonials' lands after those clear new frontiers, areas for cultivation. La Violencia most affected regions were, of course, the Andean part of the country, on Colombia's Caribbean coast, and cattle ranching activity predominated, but it wasn't really affected that much. Nevertheless, the expansion of the latifundios, I will stop here for this section. And if you have any questions, you can jump in. Then I'll move to the now, let me provide some context, additional context to this, to the period of La Violencia and the violence that followed 1958 up to 2022, if you wish. In Colombia, one of the key things that I think that is the source of or continues to be the source of conflict is the rentier economy, okay? And so if you were to, so it's not, violence is not endemic because people are violent, simply you do have structural causes of this violence. And if you were to really identify the structural cause, one of the key things is the model of economic development that was put in place in Colombia. And let me first and foremost start with a statement by one of the maybe one of the most influential people that influenced the economic policy in Colombia. The guy is Lucien Coury, who was a Canadian-born economist, and he led the first World Bank Commission to Colombia in 1949, i.e., 1 year after the beginning of the La Violencia. Lucien said, and I quote, "The fundamental right of the Colombian was not direct ownership of land. They occupied or worked, but a decent standard of living." So Lucien came with an idea that the problem of Colombia, and he came 1 year after the initiation of Civil War, 1948, in 1949, and he claimed that the fundamental right of the Colombian was not direct ownership of the land, that you're not entitled to have a land ownership. So this is not a fundamental right to have land. To have the land that you occupied, but rather at a decent standard of living. So with this ideological baggage, Colombia started from early on, more or less adopting to this type of thinking, Colombian state. So therefore, and this type of thinking, in fact, basically it's forget about the peasantry. This is an icon of the past. And therefore, we need to move Colombia to capitalism based on the cities, and therefore transforming the peasant population into urban workers. And with that, we'll end up a similar model of development like the one followed in the West. Okay. So in a way, he laid the foundation, Lucien and his likes, and his influential role was incredible, according to the way I and many others have studied his role in Colombia's, how he influenced the state policies. According to Curry's liberal economic paradigm, the problem crippling Colombia's rural economic development was not the distribution of land or its concentration in the hands of few landowners, but the absence of land markets due to lack of capital, a problem compounded by the surplus of labor in the agricultural sector. His views reflected really the dominant thinking of the hegemonic power triangle, US government, US academia, and the World Bank. Curry's paradigm and its rentier model, or rentier model variant, because we do have different rentier economies, that emerged a few decades later, rested on three pillars: extraction, agribusiness, and services. Okay. Research has demonstrated how these three activities have been undermining the food security and the livelihood of almost, as I mentioned before, 32% of the country population that depends on the agricultural sector. Between 1965 and 2020, the agricultural sector contribution to the GDP declined steeply from 27.2% to 7.6%. I repeat, from 27.2 to 7.6, the agricultural sector. Among the most affected social groups are those that, of course, that depend on family-based farming, including, of course, indigenous, Afro-Colombians, and poor mestizos peasants, which again, occupying about 25% of Colombia's total area equivalent to 34 million hectares, i.e. of which is forested. I'm sorry to give you all these figures, but this is just to for you to have some kind of understanding of the magnitude of the issue. As such, they became part of the target of dispossession by rentier capital in its multiple forms: extractive, multinational corporations, agribusiness, cattle ranching enterprises, narco-bourgeoisie investments, and land speculators. All of these actors and forces acted upon grabbing lands, basically. And as I repeat, the new characteristic of this new phase of subsumption in Colombia is not as much as exploiting labor. It's more about land grabbing. So this is the crux of the matter lies in the new political economy. Now, in Colombia, there were basically, for starters, there were two main land reforms attempts, and both of them ended in failure. And I will not go into the details of these two attempts of land reform, but the most important aspect of Colombia's maybe modern history is what we call a pact that was signed in 1972, which we call it the Pact of Chicoral. The Pact of Chicoral law, it was really a pact that led to a pact between the large landowners. And the major thing was to revoke all the attempts of land reform that were introduced by Eras Restrepo a few years before the introduction of the pact. The three objectives of the Chicoral Pact is basically forget about land reform. This is not doable, and the total really adoption of the economic thinking of the neoliberal or liberal, if you wish, because the distinction here becomes very in the global south. The distinction becomes very indistinguishable, really. Because again, they adopted what really Kerry was saying, meaning that the issue of Colombia and its development and economic development and growth is not the agricultural issue, nor is the peasant issue, nor is the distribution of land issue, but rather the economic development rests upon having a good economic policy, catering for the sectors that I have just mentioned, meaning the agribusiness, the mining, and the services. So this is basically the triangle that they had in mind. And therefore, the Chicoral Pact was forget about the issue of the land distribution, forget about the issue of the land reform, and let's focus our energy as a state in promoting these sectors, which basically it is the adoption of the spirit of what Luchlin Curry was talking about. So let me just tell you a little bit more about what happened in the 1970s and beyond. Kerry's legacy on the consolidation of the neoliberal economic doctrine from the 1970s onward, it was really one of the key things that kept regenerating conflict in Colombia up to this very moment, I would think. The idea that Colombia could develop and progress. So of course, Colombia, and this is what made me rethink about measuring the Colombian growth. Economic growth was pretty good. I mean, for the most part, from 1948 up to even 1990s, you have relatively, Colombia scored much better than its counterparts in Latin America in terms of economic growth. But the problem was not the growth. The problem was, and what I termed is you can have growth without development. So therefore, because development, you have to have measures for development, meaning how much the population standards of living is improving in terms of sanitation, infant mortality rates, or reproductive health of women, and access to basic services. In other words, we do have measures to quantify development. The measure of growth, economic growth, as such, doesn't tell me much. I mean, because if you can grow 10% per year or 15% per year, but you do have indices of poverty increasing, or income distribution is concentrating more wealth in the hands of the 0.01%, and the 99% of your population is living between extreme poverty and poverty. You see, so therefore, I would think that problematizing the issue of growth, economic growth, and add to it the substance of development is what makes it understandable. So therefore, you can have economic growth, yes, but doesn't mean that you do have development. So this is the major issue that we need to problematize. This doesn't mean that Colombia did not improve and reduce the amount of poor people or people living under the poverty line. It did, but we don't know how much, because they keep changing the methodology of measuring poverty, meaning the increased or the number of variables, i.e. the distribution of how much states give out in terms of support, and therefore they consider that another variable, and from it they can recalculate how much people are, the income of people, because of these support, they shift them from one category, from extreme poverty to poverty, for instance. And this is the kind of statistical type of thing that doesn't reflect really the amount of the disparities, the social disparities that are at work in Colombia. Excuse me. How are we doing with time, Oliver?
At the time, we've spent a good 45 minutes. I'm not the kind of person to forcefully stop such a detailed exploration. So if you want to wrap up there, that's fine by me. A few minutes more.
Okay, just 3 minutes more like this.
Yeah, that's absolutely fine, mate.
I don't have to exhaust you and in the audience as well. Let me just wrap it up quickly here, and like this, we'll have some kind of conclusion. And now, maybe the question that comes to mind now: what happens in the wake of two major developments? Really, the The first one is, of course, the signing of the agreement between the FARC and the state in 2016. And the second, which is a contingency development, which is the war in Ukraine today. And of course, these are two different things, but let me start with the 2016, which is the most important in this context. The 2016 accord between the FARC and the state is to rectify some pathologies of war rentierism anyway, and they try to. The FARC's intention, the negotiations, and so all the people and the organizations that surrounded the process, especially peasants' organizations, is to make sure that the state retakes the issue of the peasantry and the peasants, and specifically the peasants' economies, and try to protect it in a way. And so the FARC intention was to do this. And that's why the major part of the agreement was the component, the reform of the agricultural sector, and this was the major intention. Now, in the wake of the 2016 agreement, not much has changed in terms of amending the path of, or shifting in the path of the neoliberal economic model that, as I said to you, was developed since the 1949 onward. It was a gradual incremental process. It peaked in the Nkavira's government in 1990 onward, meaning it took some time of course, the thinking of Kerry did not become fully fledged, accepted by the state until maybe the Gaviria government, or maybe the period of the Barcos government started reaching a complete fruit. It matured, so to speak. Now, the 2016 agreement did not reverse this, but the possibility of having Petro, for instance, now as president could really lead to some kind of readjusting the neoliberal economic model that, in my opinion, has reached its end. And there are many international factors that help to reach this conclusion. First and foremost, the climatic change, the pressure now, global warming, and what have you. That's an additional way of moving away from fossil fuels and extractive resources such as coal and petroleum. And therefore, Colombia is also under pressure, not only internally from the accord with the FARC or the peasantry, but also international pressure in terms of shifting from shift or making an adjustment in its rentier economic structure. Moving away from fossil fuels, it means it needs to maybe reconsider its policies towards the agricultural sector and maybe reinforce the peasant economy in a way or another in order to sustain its food security. And this comes to the second point that I was saying. The Ukrainian war also exposed the vulnerabilities of Colombia's food security. Now, for instance, the fertilizers and the potassium, potash, and whatever ingredients that is needed for agriculture that usually used are imported from Russia and Belarus, and it has dwindled and therefore is affecting even the food production in Colombia. So therefore, this contingency could trigger some policy changes in Colombia, and therefore to the advantage of the peasant economy. So therefore, to conclude, therefore, you do have a contingency like this, the Ukrainian war, and the opening of the 2016 agreement with the FARC, and thirdly, the possibility of having a new president in Colombia, i.e. Petro, if he succeeds, and if they don't kill him, which is basically a possibility in the Colombian context, then we will have an opening, a political opening for change. I'll stop here and take some questions.
Thank you very much, Nazih. That was really good, really excellent, very detailed discussion, exploration of the situation facing the peasantry in Colombia. Really appreciate that, and it was an excellent talk. So we're going to open up to questions now. People are free to ask questions via chat or directly via video. It's always nice to get a bit of a seminar kind of experience. So please feel free to turn on your videos and ask a question via video. Would anyone like to go first before I take a look at the chat? Anyone wants the first word? I know we've got some questions in chat, so I'll go for it. Romania, would you like to? Yeah.
Hi. Hello, Nazih. Thank you so much for this very important talk. I was learning. I was thinking about. My name is Romana. I did my PhD I should say with the indigenous people, 13 indigenous minority communities who have been assimilated by the state in Bangladesh. My case study, I will also talk in the seminar series in May. So I'm just trying to look into that case and the Colombian case as you talk about the peasants. And I was thinking about that my case study shows that of course it started with economic development, so-called development and intervention, but the conflict led to the systematic cleansing of the indigenous people led to a nationalist conflict in Bangladesh. So I was wondering that in the case of Colombia, although there has been such systematic suppression and cleansing happening in terms of peasantry and farming and land grabbing, and we all know about all of it, those who live in this part of the world. I wonder that, do you have any comments on why the conflict, although the conflict is such long-term civil war, why has it not given any such nationalist conflict in terms of people wanting to have their own autonomous land or identity? Is there any particular reason that you could see?
Yes. Actually, thank you so much, Romana, for your questions. It's very pertinent. In fact, you do have in Colombia, the indigenous population is the closest you can have for an ethnic/identity conflict with the state. The indigenous population in Colombia has, over the years, this is nothing, even this is from the times of the colonial period, the indigenous population managed to have an autonomy, so to speak, and it varied over the period since the conquest, 1492. Okay, this autonomy thing. So it's a struggle. You can see it's a struggle of the colonial, post-colonial period And this struggle to today, as we see it today, the indigenous population of Colombia, which controls quite a good chunk of territory, is struggling for autonomy from the state, you see, and trying to exercise some kind of semi-sovereign authority over its territory, meaning the police doesn't enter its territory, they manage some form of justice within the territory. They receive funds directly from the state to them, no intermediaries. So they negotiate with the state as if they are an authority within the sovereignty of the state. So therefore, in a way, the indigenous population that are the way it's evolving its autonomy, it's a quasi goes along the lines that you were talking about. It's I could say, if you want to say it, nationalist, and in terms of it is, we can problematize the concept of nationalism in the context of the indigenous, but definitely they are looking at themselves as a state within the state, if you wish. You see, and this is not and this type of political empowerment of the indigenous is affecting also the Afro descendants, and in turn is affecting the peasantry overall. In other words, these three different groups, although all of them are peasants, but they are manifesting or reasserting their class/ethnic identity, you see. So there is something, I mean, of course, we are in the 21st century, things are changing in terms of identity politics and what have you, but nothing is replacing class. So, so class remains a common denominator, and that's why we see, although that the indigenous are trying to emphasize their autonomy vis-a-vis the state, but yet the indigenous are also enhancing the linkages with the Afro descendants and the peasantry at large. So therefore, there is a class line that binds these three groups, meaning the peasantry, the mestizos, the indigenous, and the blacks, against the large landowners and the state. So therefore, they know, but there are variations among these three groups, and their ethnic frontiers, so to speak, are more or less drawn, meaning the indigenous are protect their territories against incursions from the mestizo peasants or the Afro descendants or the state. So therefore, they are territorial in a way. And this is how sovereignty is being constructed, right? in the historically speaking. I don't know if
with that, Romana, yeah. Cheers for that, Nazir. So we've got a few more questions in the chat. Karen, would you like to ask your question directly, or shall I read it out?
You can read it out, but there's basically about 3 questions there, and they have to do with the role of violence in rural areas. Is this still affecting people? Does it have to do with drug cartels in operation? And how much are the large landowners and people who really control the land, how much are they involved? And is the military backing them in enforcing these dispossessions or supposedly ownerships of lands, and also blocking the potential for a real economic development for all people in Colombia, whether they own land, they don't own land, or wherever they live.
Thank you, Karen, for your question. Well, let me, the actors you mentioned, meaning large landowners are a major player, but large landowners in the 21st century, meaning in 2022, are not the same ones that were 50 years ago. We do have the type of landowners are drawn from narco traffickers that accumulated wealth, and they started buying lands, and they are legit now. They're not part of the new bourgeoisie, if you wish, in these areas, and they own huge pieces of lands, and they construct mansions and what have you. So you do have this is a nouveau riche type of thing, and they are sprouting all over the place. So they are changing the rural structure, if you wish. You know, you can see them, or they buy houses, or they construct houses in adjacent villages, not villages, but medium-sized cities. So this is an important actor now. It's still, and it's increasing importance because narco trafficking is increasing, and it generates, I mean, $2, $3, $4 billion a year. So we're talking about a significant amount of money that is more or less this amount comes back to Colombia and is being invested somewhere, and therefore it's generating or enhancing a group of people that with significant amount of capital. This capital is invested mostly in the rentier economy. So therefore, the narco trafficking and the narco trafficking on narco dollars had reinforced the rentier war economy, or war rentierism in Colombia. And secondly, you do have the agribusinesses and the big multinationals that they have interest in investing in Colombia's mining sector, specifically not only oil, but also you have gold and other mineral resources. So the big corporations, multinational corporations, are also an important actor that are after the land. And they don't want the peasants to be there in these lands, and peasants meaning Afro-Colombians or indigenous or mestizos, to be occupying that land or to be objecting to their investments in these areas under the legal protection, because communities and local communities, they have the right to protest. If you are a multinational to invest there, they need the multinational needs the acquiescence of the local population. In most of the cases, the local population objects to these investments because fearing the contamination of their environment, their water resources, and the speculation as well. Because the minute you have a multinational, you have other entrepreneurs coming into the village, buying more land, and therefore making the land so scarce and expensive, and affecting the rural, the peasant economy, and destroying it eventually. So that's why people are apprehensive about having multinationals coming to their territory, investing in mining. And so the multinationals in this case is another actor that is disturbing to the local communities and generators of violence, because some people related to these multinationals, directly or indirectly, they can arm groups in order to take the peasants out of these territories and therefore allow the multinationals to come in. Thirdly, you do have of course, the state and its military. The state and its military and its role in the rural communities is complex, and in many areas they end up allying with the narco traffickers and what have you. So it becomes very problematic, their existence. Okay. I don't know if you're hearing me. Are you hearing me okay?
Yep, yep.
Okay, thanks. Okay. I'm sorry, but they had another call coming in, so I don't know if you...
No problem.
Okay.
Yeah. So we've got. Are you happy with that, Karen, or do you want to come back?
Say again? No, it's okay.
Yeah.
Let
Great.
let me just. Oh, yeah. Okay. Go ahead.
Yeah. So we've got another question in the chat from Joanna. Thank you for your interesting talk, your interesting presentation, Professor Richani. May I ask you, what is the source of the forced displacement?
For the what?
What is the source of the forced displacement population during La Violencia? And have you researched this topic? I would like to know more information on this topic. Joanna's camera's not working.
One second, let me take this.
Go on. I suppose we're going to have to extend it for an extra 5 minutes.
I just wanted to comment for a moment about his comments about the Ukraine and the food scarcity situation. I think this is very true in the US too.
Yes.
What's going on now with the supplies of some of those essential to big agro. Little agro is okay. But big agro, it's going to have some problems.
Exactly, absolutely. I'm sorry, I missed the first question. What was the other question regarding the La Violencia?
Yeah, no problem. So the question, the question from Joanna is, may I ask, what is the source of the forced displacement population during La Violencia? That's the question.
It's AQUIST 1978. AQUIST is the only one that I'm aware of that did some research. I mean, and maybe eventually we will come to the bottom of it, meaning since we do have more classification, the classification system is clearer now than before. All what it is, we need to have the access to more archival work in order to come up with maybe a wider assessment than the one reached by AQUIST. But so far, I'm not aware of any other sources. We need more researchers to carry out archival work, guys. In other words. So I'm not able to do it, or maybe if I am, I will let you know. But it needs archival work. Nobody has done it so far. I mean, to my knowledge, I don't know if you find anybody, please let me know. And but we can locate the archives. We can locate the archives in order to do it.
Sounds like there's a PhD in there somewhere.
This is a PhD. This is a PhD, and I will be the advisor.
Anthony, would you like to ask a question?
Sure. No, thank you so much for the talk and for organizing this space. I'm Anthony Dest over at Lehman College. And no, I was just wondering, Professor Richani, what you thought this turn towards a recognition-based politics amongst the peasantry means for peasant struggle right now, because it seems like many movements are kind of orienting their strategy in that direction. And that is a step away from the land occupations we saw in the 1970s, or maybe other kinds of direct action tactics that have occurred over the years. So I'm wondering what you think this means for this particular conjuncture of peasant struggle in Colombia? Thank you.
Good question, Anthony. Thank you. I think it's the legalistic approach. I think that the peasant population has been impregnated with the idea of the indigenous, of negotiating with the state, obtaining from the state concessions, legal concessions, and therefore is a sense of empowerment. So in other words, I would think, my take on it, is that the indigenous experience in Colombia, and not only in Colombia, actually the indigenous experience in whole Latin America has been, and maybe most indigenous people globally speaking, let's put this in a way, is that you need to take concessions from the center of power. So the center of power, if it is the state, let it be the state. If it's the United Nations, let's go to the UN. If it's any other institution or source of authority that could influence the legal system, let's go for it. So I will think, in my opinion, the approach of obtaining in 2018, first of all, La Tutela in itself was a masterful act done by the different organizations, and the Creek, which is the indigenous representative, and other indigenous groups, in addition to the Afro-descendants and the peasant groups, they have they consider the indigenous experience as a vanguard. In a way, I would. This is my take on it. This is my analysis. I didn't. While I did ask indirectly this question to the Afro-descendants in Cauca, and you've done some research in Cauca, right, Anthony? And you worked on the Afro, right? On the
A little bit of everything.
That's good. That's good. It enriches and empowers. So basically, the Mestizo peasants, as well as the Afro, are learning the lessons of the indigenous, and so therefore, to answer the question specifically, the peasants, by obtaining this state recognition that was ignored in 1991, is basically a sense of empowerment. You see, doesn't mean much in concrete terms, but it's empowering. And this empowerment will allow the peasantry to organize, retool, and charge. So in other words, this is the beginning. Remember, we have the peasant reserves, for instance, in Colombia. That is an experiment of protecting the peasantry from the encroachment of frontier capitalism in its various forms, okay? And this protection, it means, it first and foremost, it has to be legal protection. And secondly, it has to be, social movement has to protect that. So therefore, because the state is not, cannot protect you if you're weak. The state is part of the problem, is not a neutral actor, right? The state is on the side of the encroachers, not on your side. But if you obtain from the state legal concession, you can use this argumentation, because the state is not a homogeneous actor, it's heterogeneous actor. So you can realize some state agencies will side with you against other agencies. The only agency that protects the state from all these things is the military that sides with the agro-businesses on the big, the rentier economy in a way. So it doesn't side with the peasantry, you see. And so in a way, my answer to you is complex, I know, and it's not. It's complex because the nature of the problem is complex, and the actors involved are complex. Because since we're not saying that the state is a homogeneous actor, so if we assume that the state is a heterogeneous actor with different state agencies exercising even different politics, for instance, la Defensoría del Pueblo versus the Ministry of Hacienda. You see, the Defensoría del Pueblo is correcting the abuses of the ministry, or la Fiscalía try to control the abuses of the military and the police. So in other words, we don't have this complexity at play. And I think that the peasantry in Colombia, with this recognition, will have a tool to defend its territory, a legal tool at least, to defend its territory. But the most important thing is the capacity of the peasantry of organizing locally and regionally and internationally, meaning the peasants, you know, it's amazing from my research in the peasant reserves of Cimitarra, for instance, that I investigated for this book, is that they're not only focusing on local organizations, but also they're building bridges with international organizations. So the sense of empowerment is not only drawn from the state or local agencies of the state, but also building bridges with international organizations and what have you. So that they think that the peasantry in the most remote areas, in other words, in Colombia, are feeling, or even this applies not only to Colombia, so it's a global thing. I mean, peasants in Bangladesh or Sri Lanka or somewhere in Africa, also they are aware of what the social media is offering, what international theater is offering them in terms of support and defend their territory and their autonomy versus the abuses of the state and capital. So that's what.
Well, if I can abuse chair's privileges and ask, a final couple of questions, because I'm dying to ask you a couple of questions. If there's no one else got the hand up, the first point is, is relating to your thesis. Seems to be focuses on, the agro industry is gradually leading to the destruction of the peasantry to small scale farming, but there's some counter tendencies. And I'm just wondering, what about the case of coffee? Because traditionally coffee in Colombia, I mean, I certainly don't describe it as this, but people have described it as, kind of democratic in the sense that it's based on small scale farming. It's, it's been widely shared. Hasn't this idea, the kind of the way coffee is organized, the production, isn't this, one of the reasons for the longevity of the peasantry in Colombia? Is it kind of production that allows small scale farming to be more competitive? You seem to disagree that, ultimately agri-industry is undermining coffee. How's that the case? That's my first question. And my second question relates to the question of forced displacement. There's this hegemonic conventional definition of forced displacement, the Colombian Truth Commission, for example, the state, which leads them to, calculate that about 7 million people have been forcefully displaced. But that's because they define forced displacement, in my view, in a very narrow way, which is, essentially, directly resulting from violence, from somebody carrying a gun and basically saying, give me your farm and leave. But what about the displacement of capitalism, which seems to be a thesis in your research, this policy of scorched earth? If we use this, this broader definition of forced displacement, i.e. millions of peasants have had to leave because they can't compete with these bigger, agro-industrial companies, then it gives us a much bigger number of forced displaced. It's no longer 7 million. We're talking about tens of millions of people who've been forcibly placed. And my view is the Truth Commission and the Colombian state don't use this definition of forced displacement, because then it leads to a kind of criticism of capitalist development per se. So I'm just wondering what you think about that.
Okay. Let me start with the first question regarding the coffee sector. Oliver, the coffee production, of course, in Colombia depends chiefly on small producers of coffee, okay? This is predominantly this. Coffee is based on two major things, right? The producers, so which are small producers, and the ones that are doing the commercialization, which is the big thing, which is the Fede Cafe and what have you. This is where capitalists are, meaning in the commercialized aspect and the linkage with the global capital and global markets. This is where the money is. Now, but coffee production still relies on these small producers up till now. They are the proletariat, so to speak. So they're being used in the capital chain in a so far so good type of. But there are changes within the coffee, the small producers as well. Many of the fincas, for instance, are moving from coffee to other things, to coca, due to the fluctuation in the prices of coffee and the prices that Fede Cafe is trying to impose on to exploit them to the maximum and pay them the least for their production. So there are problems in the production. I don't know how many, I don't have the figures, how many of the small coffee producers have left or abandoned their coffee production and shifted to or are supplementing it with coca production or other commodities. I have no idea. I mean, I'm sure that there are some people that are working on the issue of the coffee sector that are in better place to answer specifically the question of what's happening in the coffee sector. Now, regarding your second question, which is the forced displacement, yeah, you're right. I mean, the only thing that discrepancy that I found in terms of the statistical data that is available, I mentioned to you that we know that 32% of the population, roughly speaking, of Colombia, according to the United Nations UNDP figures, live in rural areas. But from this 32, doesn't mean all of them are peasants. According to the Danish statistics, we have 28.4%. So there is a difference here of whatever the percentage is. But we do not know for a fact how much you're saying that the economic displacement, if you wish, by capital. We know the first, in my opinion, the first displacement is done because of capital and it serves the interest of capital. But we call it forced displacement. But you're talking about, without putting a gun to your head, you are moving away because simply you cannot make a living anymore in the rural sector.
Which is a form of force, no? It's, you know. It's...
Correct. But we're being literal here. Okay. Anyway, we're being as literal as possible, meaning forced displacement, meaning that you were afraid and for your life, and or some people came to you and said, listen, man, if you don't leave, we'll kill you. Or they kill your neighbor, and therefore you saw what happened to your neighbor and you flee the village. So in other words, we do have conceptually a method, not conceptually, but methodologically speaking, this type of measures. What we accepted that we do have in Colombia, more or less, accepted definition that we do have about 7 million people that were forcefully displaced. Now, you are incorporating a new category which is economically displaced. I cannot answer this, to be honest with you, because I don't have nobody maybe has the statistics to tell you how many of these people or more people left the rural sector because simply they couldn't find, or they cannot make a living anymore. You see, the only way we can infer this, I mean, this is or extrapolate from that, is the increase of the population of the urban centers and the depletion of the rural sector in areas or municipalities that doesn't have any violence. So we can extrapolate from, meaning municipalities that do not have violent actors, paramilitaries or descendants of the FARC or any form of violence, and people are leaving, then we can make an estimate of the how many municipalities are free of any violence. But we do have many municipalities. More than 50% of municipalities of Colombia doesn't have much of violence. So it's not spread in every single municipality. So violence is concentrated in specific regions, specific municipalities out of the global. So therefore we can extrapolate from the municipalities that doesn't have any violence in them and see how many people are leaving. So Oliver, do research, man. You can and share with us what you find.
Well, thank you very much for that, Dr. Richani. That was, a really interesting, fascinating discussion. I'm sure I speak on behalf of everybody here that, we got a lot of information, a lot of detail, and it was really enjoyable to listen to. So thank you very much, Nazih. Well, that's it for today from here at CSSGJ. If you want to take a look, we've got some other talks upcoming. We've got Romana giving a talk very soon on armed conflict in Bangladesh. So that'll be a fantastic talk to come in to listen to. I hope everybody has a nice day, and see you all soon. All the best. Cheers. Great talk, mate. Really good stuff.
I'm glad to. I didn't know if it made sense to you all, but I tried to make it as succinct as possible.
Yeah. No, so you, no, that was, it was a lot of detail involved. It was, a serious amount of detail in terms of exploring the Colombian peasantry. So I like that,
So how many people did you have?
So we had 12 people and we got down to 10, which is kind of average for us, but it's all about interests, isn't it? It's about and time and all the rest of it. So, I'm very happy with that. And it's good to get people interacting as well,
That's for sure. No, that's good. That's good. So 10 to 12 attended. That's good.
Yeah. No, it is good for a seminar,
No, good, man. This is good. No, seriously, it's good. Thank you.
Are you giving any more talks? I'm
trying to avoid doing that, but I need to concentrate. This is time consuming, as you may know. But I try to do the